Picture a map of the Atlantic world in 1717. Start in the cold gray harbors of London and Bristol, where merchant ships loaded with European goods set out across open ocean. Follow the trade routes south and west, past the Azores, past Madeira, past the Canary Islands, down toward the bulge of West Africa, where slaving ships filled their holds with human cargo. Now trace those routes westward across the Atlantic, riding the trade winds toward the Caribbean. Watch the lines converge on a scattered chain of islands stretching from Trinidad in the south to Cuba in the north, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, each one a jewel in the British, French, or Spanish empires, each one connected to the others by narrow shipping lanes that threaded between shallow reefs and volcanic coastlines. Now zoom in. Tighten the frame on the waters between the Carolinas and the Caribbean. This corridor, running from Nassau in the Bahamas up through the outer banks of North Carolina, was the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth. Not because of the weather, not because of the reefs, because of who was waiting there. Somewhere in those warm blue waters, a ship was prowling. She was a former French slave vessel called La Concorde, but her new captain had renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge. She carried 40 cannons. Her crew numbered 300 men, and her captain had sewn slow-burning fuses into his beard so that his face was wreathed in smoke and fire when he boarded your ship. His name was Edward Teach. History knows him as Blackbeard. And if you saw his flag on the horizon, your life as you knew it was already over. This is the story of what actually happened to the people he captured. Not the romantic version, not the Hollywood version, the real one. And it is far worse than anything you've been told. To understand why Blackbeard was different from every other pirate in the Caribbean, you need to understand what piracy actually looked like in 1717. The popular image is of rogue outlaws who attacked anything that moved, but the reality was more complicated and, in some ways, more terrifying. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1690 to 1730, was the product of a very specific set of circumstances. European empires had been fighting each other across the Caribbean for decades. England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands all had colonies in the region, and they all used privateers to harass each other's shipping during wartime. Privateers were essentially government-sponsored pirates. They carried letters of marque, official documents that gave them permission to attack enemy ships and keep a share of the plunder. During the War of the Spanish Succession, which ended in 1714, thousands of sailors made a living this way. Then the war ended. And suddenly, all those experienced, heavily armed sailors were out of work. The colonial governments didn't want them anymore. The Royal Navy didn't need them. The merchant marine didn't pay enough to feed a family. So thousands of them did the only thing they knew how to do. They kept raiding ships. They just stopped asking permission first. Nassau in the Bahamas became the unofficial capital of this new pirate republic. At its peak, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates operated out of Nassau, and the tiny colonial government was powerless to stop them. The island had a perfect natural harbor, fresh water, and it sat right on top of the major shipping lanes between the Caribbean and the American colonies. This was the world Edward Teach entered when he arrived in the Caribbean sometime around 1716. And within 2 years, he would become the most feared man in the Western Hemisphere. What set Blackbeard apart wasn't his body count. In fact, there's no reliable historical evidence that Blackbeard ever killed a single person until his final battle. Read that again. The most terrifying pirate in history may never have murdered anyone during his entire career of piracy. That fact alone should tell you something important about how he operated. Because Blackbeard didn't need to kill people. He had something far more effective than violence. He had theater. Everything about Blackbeard was designed to make you surrender before a single shot was fired. Start with his appearance. Edward Teach was described by Captain Charles Johnson, who published the first major account of pirate lives in 1724, as a tall, broad man with a thick black beard that covered most of his face and grew down to his chest. He braided the beard into small tails tied with ribbons. And during battle, he wove slow-burning hemp cord, soaked in saltpeter and lime water, into those braids and lit them on fire. Imagine seeing that coming toward you across the water. A massive figure standing at the bow of a 40-gun warship, his face half hidden behind a curtain of smoke and sparks, pistols strapped across his chest in a bandolier, cutlass in hand, his crew howling behind him. You haven't slept properly in weeks because you're a merchant sailor making 12 shillings a month. You're malnourished, you're exhausted, and now the devil himself is climbing over your gunwale. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. That was the point. Blackbeard wanted you to believe he was the devil, because the devil doesn't negotiate. The devil takes what he wants. And this strategy worked almost every single time. Ship after ship surrendered to Blackbeard without a fight. Captains struck their colors the moment they saw his flag, a skeleton stabbing a heart while toasting the devil. They surrendered because they knew what happened to people who resisted. The stories traveled faster than any ship, but surrendering didn't mean you were safe. It meant you were now Blackbeard's property. And what happened next depended entirely on his mood, his needs, and how useful he decided you were. The first thing that happened when Blackbeard's crew boarded your ship was the inventory, not of the cargo, of you. Pirates needed skilled sailors, and they were always recruiting. If you were a carpenter, a surgeon, a navigator, or a cook, your capture was going to look very different than if you were an ordinary deckhand, or worse, a passenger. Skilled tradesmen were often forced into pirate service. This was a legal distinction that mattered enormously because being a forced man meant you might avoid the gallows if you were ever captured by the authorities. Pirates would sometimes give forced men written certificates stating they had been taken against their will. This sounds almost civilized until you realize what it actually meant. It meant you were being enslaved. You were being told that your old life was over, that you now served this crew, and that if you tried to escape or refused to work, you would be punished in ways that would make you wish they'd simply killed you. The records from pirate trials in the early 18th century are filled with testimony from these forced men, and their accounts are harrowing. They describe being stripped of their possessions, their clothing, and their identity. They describe being watched constantly for signs of disloyalty. They describe being forced to participate in attacks on other ships, which made them legally complicit in piracy and therefore less likely to run, because they knew they'd hang too. Blackbeard was particularly aggressive about forced recruitment. When he captured La Concorde, the French slave ship he converted into Queen Anne's Revenge, he took at least 14 members of the French crew into his own service. Some went willingly, others did not. The distinction didn't matter much when you were standing on the deck of a pirate ship 300 miles from the nearest friendly port. But forced service was actually one of the better outcomes, because if Blackbeard didn't need you, things got considerably worse. The standard procedure for unwanted captives varied from pirate to pirate, but Blackbeard had a reputation for psychological cruelty that went beyond what most of his contemporaries practiced. The historical record contains several specific incidents that illustrate what it was like to be at his mercy. The most documented case comes from the testimony of Samuel Odell, a merchant captain who was captured by Blackbeard in 1718. Odell later described being brought aboard Queen Anne's Revenge and subjected to hours of interrogation about his cargo, his route, and whether he had hidden any valuables. Blackbeard's method of interrogation was simple. He would ask a question. If he didn't like the answer, one of his crew would hit the captive with the flat of a cutlass. If he still didn't like the answer, the edge came next. Odell described watching other captives being beaten so severely that bones broke. He described men being hung over the side of the ship by their arms, their feet dangling above the water, sharks circling below, while Blackbeard's crew demanded to know where the gold was hidden. The fact that there often was no hidden gold didn't stop the questioning, because the interrogation wasn't really about finding treasure. It was about establishing dominance. It was about making sure every person on that captured ship understood at a molecular level that Blackbeard owned them. And then there were the games. Pirate crews, especially large ones like Blackbeard's 300 men, needed entertainment. Weeks at sea with nothing to do bred boredom, and bored pirates were dangerous pirates. So captains encouraged games, contests, and what they called diversions. For Blackbeard, captives were the diversions. One practice that appears in multiple accounts was forced combat. Captives would be given weapons, usually just knives or short sticks, and made to fight each other while the pirate crew watched and wagered. The losers weren't always killed. Sometimes they were simply beaten again. But the psychological damage of being forced to fight another terrified prisoner for the entertainment of your captors is the kind of thing that breaks a person in ways that don't heal. Another documented practice was what pirates called sweating. A captive would be stripped and forced to run in circles around the mainmast while crew members jabbed at them with forks, swords, and broken bottles. The game continued until the captive collapsed from exhaustion, blood loss, or both. Sweating was practiced across the Caribbean pirate community, not just by Blackbeard, but his crew was known for taking it further and lasting longer than most. There was also the question of what happened to the women on captured ships. The historical record here is sparse, partly because relatively few women traveled on merchant vessels in this period, and partly because the surviving accounts were written by men who had reasons to minimize or omit certain details. What we do know is that pirate articles, the written codes of conduct that governed pirate ships, almost universally prohibited bringing women aboard or assaulting female captives. But pirate articles were ideals, not realities. The enforcement mechanism was the crew itself, and a crew of 300 men, many of them drunk, many of them violent by nature, many of them operating outside any legal or moral framework, was not a reliable guardian of anyone's safety. The court testimony from various pirate trials includes oblique references to things done to female captives that the witnesses refused to describe in detail. The silences in the historical record are sometimes louder than the words. Blackbeard himself was known to have had as many as 14 wives, though the details of these marriages are murky. At least some of these women were likely captives, or the daughters of captives, coerced into relationships that the word marriage barely covers. One account, possibly apocryphal but widely circulated in the 18th century, describes Blackbeard forcing a young woman he had recently married to watch while he was intimate with members of his crew, as a form of humiliation and control. Whether this specific story is true, the pattern it describes, using sexual violence and degradation as tools of psychological dominance, is consistent with what we know about how power operated on pirate ships. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of being captured by Blackbeard wasn't any single act of cruelty. It was the randomness. Blackbeard was known for dramatic, unpredictable behavior that kept everyone around him, including his own crew, in a constant state of anxiety. Captain Johnson's account includes a famous incident in which Blackbeard, while drinking below decks with his pilot and another crew member, suddenly blew out the candle, drew 2 pistols under the table, and fired. One shot missed. The other shattered the knee of his pilot, Israel Hands, crippling him for life. When asked why he'd done it, Blackbeard reportedly said that if he didn't shoot 1 or 2 men now and then, they'd forget who he was. Think about what it meant to be a captive aboard a ship run by someone who operated on that principle. You never knew what was coming. You never knew if the next hour would bring casual conversation or casual mutilation. You couldn't predict his moods. You couldn't appease him, because appeasement was just another form of weakness, and weakness attracted violence the way blood attracted sharks. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. This psychological warfare extended to the way Blackbeard handled negotiations with colonial authorities. In 1718, he blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest cities in British America. For nearly a week, no ship could enter or leave the harbor. He captured several vessels during the blockade, including one carrying some of Charleston's most prominent citizens. Then he sent a message to the governor. He didn't want gold, he didn't want jewels, he wanted a chest of medicine. This seems bizarre until you understand the context. Blackbeard's crew was riddled with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, common afflictions among sailors of the period. He needed mercury-based treatments, which were the standard, if largely ineffective, medical response to syphilis at the time. But the method of his demand was pure Blackbeard. He sent his lieutenant Richards ashore with several hostages and a simple ultimatum: deliver the medicine chest or the hostages die. Their heads would be sent to the governor and every ship in the harbor would be burned. The governor complied. The medicine was delivered. The hostages were returned alive, though stripped of their valuables, their clothing, and in some cases, their dignity. Several of the hostages later described being held in the dark hull of Queen Anne's Revenge for days, listening to the sounds of the pirates above them, not knowing if they would live or die, not knowing if the governor would meet the demands, not knowing anything except that they were utterly powerless. One of the hostages was a member of the Charleston Council named Samuel Wragg. His young son was with him. They were both returned alive, but Wragg was described afterward as a changed man. The experience had broken something in him that didn't come back. The blockade of Charleston illustrates something crucial about Blackbeard's approach to captives. He used them as leverage, as currency, as tools. A captive wasn't a person to him. A captive was a resource to be deployed for maximum strategic effect. And when a captive stopped being useful, they were discarded. Sometimes that meant being put ashore on a deserted beach. Sometimes it meant being set adrift in a small boat without water. Sometimes it meant worse. The practice of marooning deserves special attention here because it was one of the most feared punishments in the pirate world, and Blackbeard used it both as a punishment for his own crew and as a disposal method for captives he had no further use for. Marooning meant being left on a small, uninhabited island or a stretch of deserted coastline with minimal supplies. In the Caribbean version, you were typically given a pistol with a single shot, a small amount of water, and perhaps a knife. The pistol wasn't for hunting. Everyone understood what the pistol was for. It was for when you couldn't stand the thirst, the sun, the insects, and the slow approach of death any longer. It was mercy, pirate style. Some marooned men were found alive, days or weeks later, by passing ships. Their testimony describes experiences that read like something from a horror novel. Drinking their own urine when the water ran out, eating raw seabirds, insects, anything that moved, watching the horizon for a sail that never came, slowly going mad from isolation and exposure. Blackbeard marooned at least 2 groups of people during his career that we know about. After the Charleston blockade, when he ran Queen Anne's Revenge aground at Beaufort Inlet, possibly deliberately, he transferred his best crew and most of his treasure to a smaller sloop and left a significant number of men stranded on a sandbar. These weren't captives. These were his own crew members, men who had sailed with him, fought with him, trusted him. He abandoned them without supplies on a strip of sand in the middle of a tidal inlet. They were eventually rescued, but the incident reveals something essential about how Blackbeard viewed other human beings. They were tools. When they stopped being useful, they were left behind. If that's how he treated his own men, imagine how he treated his prisoners. And this brings us to the deeper horror, the one that doesn't involve physical violence at all. The worst thing about being captured by Blackbeard was the uncertainty. You had no idea what was going to happen to you. Every interaction was a negotiation with chaos. You might be treated relatively well, given food and water, and eventually released. You might be tortured for information you didn't have. You might be forced into pirate service for months or years. You might be marooned on a sand spit to die of thirst. You might be fined for 3 days, and then, on the 4th day, for no reason you could discern, someone would decide to use you for target practice. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Blackbeard cultivated unpredictability the way other people cultivated reputations for honor or fairness. His unpredictability was his brand. It was the thing that made merchants surrender without fighting. It was the thing that made colonial governors give him what he wanted. It was the thing that made his own crew afraid to challenge him. Because you couldn't plan for someone who didn't follow rules. You couldn't negotiate with someone whose demands might change mid-sentence. You couldn't reason with someone who might shoot his own pilot under the dinner table just to make a point. The captives who survived encounters with Blackbeard and left testimony for the historical record almost universally described the same experience. Not the pain, not the humiliation, not the theft. They described the fear of not knowing, the constant, grinding, inescapable anxiety of being completely at the mercy of someone who might have no mercy at all. Modern psychology has a name for this. It's called learned helplessness. When an organism is subjected to repeated unpredictable stress with no possibility of escape or control, it eventually stops trying to escape or exert control at all. It becomes passive, compliant, broken. This is what happens to prisoners of war. This is what happens to hostages. This is what happened to the people Blackbeard captured. And Blackbeard understood this instinctively 3 centuries before psychologists gave it a name. He understood that the most effective prison isn't made of iron bars. It's made of uncertainty. His career lasted only about 2 years. From roughly 1716 to November 1718, when he was finally cornered and killed by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy in a vicious battle at Ocracoke Inlet. By the time Maynard's men finished with him, Blackbeard had been shot 5 times and stabbed more than 20 times. They cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as proof of the kill. The legend says his headless body was thrown overboard and swam around the ship 3 times before sinking. That's almost certainly not true, but the fact that the story was told at all, and believed by many, tells you everything about the kind of fear this man generated. Even in death, people needed to believe he was more than human. Because the alternative, that an ordinary man had done all of this, was somehow worse. The aftermath of Blackbeard's death brought some closure for the colonial authorities, but not much for his victims. Many of the men forced into his crew were arrested and put on trial. Some were acquitted on the grounds that they had served under duress. Others were hanged. The distinction between willing pirate and forced man was often a matter of who had better testimony, or a better lawyer, or better connections. The captives who had been robbed and released went back to their lives, but the psychological damage lingered. The historical record doesn't have a word for PTSD in the 18th century, but the descriptions are unmistakable. Men who couldn't sleep, men who flinched at loud noises, men who refused to go to sea again, giving up their livelihoods rather than risk another encounter. Samuel Wragg, the Charleston councilman, spent the rest of his life dealing with the political and personal fallout of his captivity. And the people who were marooned, the ones who survived, carried marks that went beyond the physical. Dehydration, sunburn, and malnutrition leave scars, but the isolation left deeper ones. Weeks alone on a strip of sand with a single bullet and nothing but the sound of the ocean will reshape a human mind in ways that don't reverse. This is the part of the pirate story that never makes it into the movies. The adventure, the treasure, the swashbuckling. That's all there, and it sells tickets. But behind every golden doubloon in Blackbeard's treasury was a person who had been terrorized, robbed, beaten, or abandoned. Behind every cannon on Queen Anne's Revenge was a story of someone's worst day. The romantic image of piracy, the one with the jaunty flag and the clever captain and the freedom of the open sea, is a lie, or at best it's a half-truth that leaves out the half that matters. Piracy was organized crime conducted on water. Blackbeard was not a lovable rogue. He was a man who built an empire on the systematic destruction of other people's sense of safety, autonomy, and hope. And the worst part, the part that should keep you up at night, is that it worked. For 2 years, Blackbeard terrorized the most powerful empires on Earth. He shut down one of America's busiest ports. He commanded a fleet. He answered to no one. And he did it all by understanding a simple, awful truth about human nature. You don't have to hurt everyone. You just have to make everyone believe you might. The ocean is quieter now. The shipping lanes between the Carolinas and the Caribbean carry container ships and cruise liners instead of wooden merchantmen. Ocracoke Inlet, where Blackbeard died, is a tourist destination. You can take a ferry there. You can swim in the same waters where his headless body supposedly made its final swim. But if you stand on that beach at night, When the tourists are gone and the only sound is the waves, you can almost feel it. The weight of all that fear soaked into the sand and the water and the history of the place. 300 years of it. Edward Teach understood something that we all spend our lives trying not to think about. That civilization is a thin line, that the rules we live by only work because enough of us agree to follow them, and that when someone decides not to follow them, when someone decides to light their beard on fire and sail a 40-gun warship into your harbor, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, standing between you and the void. That was the horror of being captured by Blackbeard. Not the violence, not the theft, not the physical pain. It was the realization, immediate and total and irreversible, that the world you thought you lived in, the one with laws and rules and consequences, didn't exist out here. Out here, there was only the ocean and the ship and the man with the burning beard, and you belonged to him now.